Hello there, you two. This is in defense of Oswald Chesterfield Cobblepot, also known as the Penguin.
You can be a goody two-shoes till the end of your days. You can listen to them say crime never pays. You can follow every law and fear the big black bat. But why would you want to? Where's the fun in that? Where's the fun in that? So smile, darn you smile. Everybody loves to grin. Follow my lead, recite my creed, and smile, darn you smile.
Yes, apologies for the theatrics. This is a series in which I shall be looking at some of the so-called villains of the DC Universe and presenting the case for their defense.
Batman to Coast Guard. Batman to Coast Guard. There's a drifting submarine 2 miles east of Sandy Nose Lightship. It's filled with human jets.
Yes, it is a very hard struggle to defend some of the DC villains. However, they are pretty much universally always more interesting characters than the heroes they face. And with DC starting to blur the lines between hero and villain to almost ridiculous level with titles like Red Hood and the Outlaws, Suicide Squad, previous universe, Secret Six, I think it's high time that some of the more established so-called nasty pieces of work in the DC Universe had their own fair crack at the whip. And let's begin with somebody relatively easy. My all-time favourite villain, the Penguin. A lot of the appeal of a character, regardless of their status as a hero or villain, comes from their background. And with Cobblepot, he has particular relevance to me because of the fact that he's victim of bullying. He's not too badly off to start with, but the sort of the pressure down on him kind of makes him snap. He's got this very awkward appearance, and he's more comfortable with, in his case, birds than he is with people. And this isn't a superpower, this is just him being very experienced with birds and knowing a lot about them, which is something that some people don't quite get. It isn't a superpower at all. He doesn't command birds. It's not a meta power. He just knows them very well. So we have this guy who's been clamped down on all his life, and how this affects his personality is that he has something of a persecution complex, which is understandable, of course, for anyone in his position. But he harnesses this persecution complex to great effect in that he can allow himself to sort of appear to lose for a time whilst waiting to find the right weakness and then strike back, which he did with the Black Mask, which he's done with so many of the other big-time gangsters. The Falcones, the Mariones, all the big names in Gotham have suffered from this tactic. He's also become this tactical and technical genius, surpassing even Batman in some cases. So yeah, there's a lot to like there. He really wouldn't be that villainous if it hadn't been forced upon him by the abuse he suffered. And he, through his time in Suicide Squad, his brief appearance in Secret Six, and others, he's now got this kind of anti-hero persona to it, whereby even Batman respects that he's not likely to be able to put away the Penguin again. Now he's managed to sort of so successfully separate his business from his criminal doings and basically make himself untouchable. But so he instead uses him as a kind of a source, and the spats between the two very rarely result in the Penguin ever being arrested. They just tend to involve a sort of it's like an ongoing Cold War that has its occasional flashpoints, which is, I think, something that appeals a bit more than someone like the Joker, who just has to be kept locked away otherwise. And when he does get out, it's usually because he's escaped rather than being let out, because there's very little to redeem about him. Whereas you have the Penguin, who is pretty much untouchable. He's pretty much always out, but he's not really a threat for the most part. He's more of an asset, and that in itself is a great factor in his favour. Just occasionally a character will say something that basically sums up their entire philosophy in one short phrase or sentence or speech. And with the Penguin, that would be Batman the Animated Series, the episode known as Birds of a Feather, where he's attempting to go straight.
Oswald, I really was growing fond of you. It's too bad, isn't it?
I suppose it's true what they say. Society is to blame. High society.
Yes, class politics are a major part of the Penguin's philosophy. But not so much him hating people for being rich. I mean, he'd hate himself a lot more than he already does if he just hated people for being rich. But he hates bullies. And he really just cannot stand anybody abusing power given to them. And he sees this in everybody who has any power. Even the likes of Bruce Wayne, he sees it in. Which is very insightful, although maybe somewhat misguided in the fact that his previous experiences are influencing him. Anyhow, he's got this thing with bullies, and he just cannot stand them in any shape or form. He will fight them openly, but he does, however, as a bully victim, know when he's beaten. And when he's beaten, what he'll do is he'll play along just long enough to see an opportunity to seize the initiative again, which he did with Black Mask, which allowed him to overthrow Black Mask's empire. There's another dimension to this, of course, that he doesn't like children, and that I can relate to. I think this is a more recent development than anything else. Certainly I'm not aware of this happening before the famous Tim Burton interpretation, played by Danny DeVito. But it makes a lot of sense in terms of the character, the real character, not the Tim Burton character. I will go on to that later. But it makes sense for him not to like kids, because he was bullied as a child. He's always had this kind of dislike of kids and attachment to adults, which is explored in Prejudice. And that, to me, is actually an appealing factor, but I can understand why some people wouldn't particularly like that aspect in a character. And yes, he does resemble the child catcher somewhat in his appearance. I think, again, this is a more modern take on the character and a newer development. But I can totally understand why he doesn't like children, and have very similar reasons myself for not liking children. But it's not necessarily something you can have a go at him for, because, sad to say it, but children are just as nasty as adults, and anybody who tells you otherwise is deluding themselves, frankly. One of the reasons that the Penguin continues to have appeal despite his villainy is that his modus operandi is, for the most part, utterly harmless.
My baby! Did you miss me? did you miss me?
Great speech, Oswald.
My name is not Oswald. It's Penguin. I am not a human being. I am an animal. Cold-blooded. Crank the AC. Where are my lists? Bring me the names. It's time. These are the names of the firstborn sons of Gotham City. Just like I was. And like me, a terrible fate waits for them. Tonight, while their parents party, they'll be dreaming away in their safe cribs, their soft beds, and we will snatch them, carry them into the sewer, and toss them into a deep, dark, watery grave.
Penguin? I mean, killing sleeping children, isn't that a little,
No, it's a lot.
Yet another example of how Batman Returns misses the point. The Penguin is not a violent killer. He's no Joker, he's no Black Mask even. He is a businessman first and foremost, but a criminal secondly. His sort of central interest is sort of keeping his little segment of the city going. And if people get hurt in his efforts to do that, they're usually people who deserve it. And as I said, he's got a real dislike of bullies of any description, so although it may seem somewhat minor when they bully, what the offence a bully commits against him or one of his employees, they get a punishment that's completely out of proportion because he can't stand bullies. The classic example being from Pain and Prejudice.
You? Nah. Let me tell you what's happening right now in your world. Your boss discovered some inconsistencies in your quarterly sales figures. A bit of moderately challenging forensic accounting shows you have embezzled from him a tidy little sum. It seems you left a pot of soup boiling on the stove before you went out tonight. Those old apartments, well, they just go up like kindling. Poor Mrs. Nazarian on the first floor. I know you were close to her, but those fandangled window catches, so hard for elderly hands. Your mother and father had an unfortunate detour on their little weekend getaway. It seems their brake lines were eroded by rust. Most tragic. Of course, they did charge you with taking their car for a tune-up last week. So their last thoughts were probably, well, no need to belabor the point. And Jenny, sweet Jenny, a delusional psychopath is planning to stick her with an infected needle. Infected with what, you ask? Oh, let's just say the drugs haven't yet caught up to this one. Such bad luck, poor dear. She should be feeling the prick the needle right about now. I'd love to catch up more, but I'm needed downstairs. Have a nice weekend.
Yeah, a bit harsh for just calling him a fat ass, but hear me out on this. Somebody who's had that amount of sort of attention, bullying attention put on them, is going to react like that to any bully if they have that amount of power. Classic example from real life, look at David Blunkett. David Blunkett had a real tough time at a specialist school for the blind whilst he was growing up. and it was a really, really tough time that stayed with him all this time. As such, he pushed through this plan called inclusion in the British education system. This plan was to facilitate severe special needs students to go into the mainstream schools. The problem was, of course, this plan also involved cutting a lot of funding for the specialist schools for people with severe needs that just couldn't fit into the mainstream. And we've been living with the fallout from that ever since, which is, it's an example of an extreme reaction that in some ways is even more horrific than the Penguin's overreaction to that kid calling it, well, not kid, young man calling him a fouls, because it's affected millions upon millions of children. Moving on to the rest of his modus operandi, the Penguin is an utter genius when it comes to gadgetry and tactics. He's easily the tactical equivalent of Batman. He's easily just as inventive as the likes of T.O. Morrow. And considering T.O. Morrow is the premier mad scientist of the DC universe, well, on Earth anyway, it's quite impressive that he's managed to create robots better than his. He's got gadgetry weapons, and let's face it, he's got better dress sense than Mr. Oh, I'm a great big supervillain, but I'm just going to wear a Hawaiian shirt. Oh, T.O. Morrow. Yeah, still haven't got over that. Anyhow, yes, what we're looking at here is an ingenious guy whose crimes are somewhat petty for the most part, but when he's pushed into a corner and he's ramped up enough, he can go to greater extremes against those he believes deserves it. And he's willing to work with Batman, work with other heroes, and he's also very, very driven to stick up for the little guy. I realise I'm making a massive assumption in that considering all comics to get the Penguin right every time, because frankly they don't. But what I'm looking at here is wider media portrayal of the Penguin. And in some ways it's got it very right, in others it's got it very wrong. Well, let's begin with Burgess Meredith. Burgess Meredith was the first person to play the Penguin on film and television, and he wasn't given really much to go on beyond having read a few of the comic books, and he was up against some stiff competition from other actors playing villains in that show. We had Judy Newmar's Catwoman, we had Cesar Romero's Joker, and of course the incredible Frank Gorshin Riddler, who is the sole reason that character is still around. I'm sorry, but the Riddler would have gone the same way as the Penny Plunderer if it wasn't for Frank Gorshin making him awesome. And maybe that'd be good for a discussion to have in a future episode, but Meredith gave the Penguin this kind of more sort of bird-like manner to him, and invented the famous whack completely by accident, in that he was recovering from throat cancer. He'd been told to lay off the cigarettes, but he needed to have the cigarette there as a prop. So just occasionally some smoke would get caught in his throat and he'd be irritated, it would irritate his lungs and he'd have to cough. And rather than risk doing a retake, he'd turn that cough into a and that kind of stuck. But it's now such an iconic part of the character that I don't think there's been a portrayal since that hasn't had a whack. And some people say the Arkham City one didn't have a whack, but it actually does. If you listen to him laugh in the scene with the freeze gun, yeah, he does have a whack, but it's just not a bit more of a subtle one. I love the Burgess Meredith portrayal in that he's got the Irish-American accent, he's got the class, or the pretensions to class, and a very sort of a gangstery mannerism. But at the same time, I think Meredith kind of missed the point. Well, everybody misses the point of the villains in there because they wanted to play the villains as villains rather than give them their full backstory. So yes, the Penguin doesn't have his sort of social conscience in that portrayal. There is a bit more of that when we go on to the Tim Burton portrayal, played by Danny DeVito, in that version is very socially conscious because of the fact that he has a really harsher alternate origin story than any of the others. What I think happened was Burton wanted to write a story with Killer Croc and then rewrote it for the Penguin because they said, no, nobody knows Killer Croc. Because basically the Penguin story in that is Killer Croc's story, and the plot reads like a Killer Croc plot. Aside from the occasional use of an umbrella gadget, they could cut and paste and put Killer Croc in that role and it would work perfectly. It's not the Penguin. And I think, to an extent, the Danny DeVito portrayal there has done more damage to the Penguin's image than any other alternate media portrayal. Although, having said that, there's a lot to be said about the fact that people have picked up on the Burgess Meredith Penguin and used him for purposes of political satire. And whenever they want to take the mickey out of usually a Republican, American Republican or British Conservative, they will put the Penguin costume on and go for the aristocrat. But that's not the point. Penguin isn't an aristocrat. Well, he's from a wealthy family, but he isn't an aristocrat at heart. And that, to me, is something a greater portrayal than just cutting and pasting him into a Killer Croc story. Though I will give the Burton version credit for bringing up his fear of children, which I don't think existed before, his fear and irrational hatred of children, because that's somewhat offsets. It kind of explains how some cases he does actually end up in Arkham in some stories, because I'd never really understood that, because by Batman villain standards the Penguin is perfectly sane, and yet they're constantly throwing him in Arkham. I mean, I have a similar problem with Catwoman, but it's I suppose it's a story. It's a story device, Arkham, and they even take the mickey out of it in the later Batman comics. But I think ramping up the crazy and basically turning him into Killer Croc was a bad move. Ever since then, we've had a lot of mix and matches of the Burgess Meredith and the Danny DeVito Penguins, because both are so good that it's difficult to top. So rather than do something new, they decided to go with the old, but give their own twist on it, which is classic of the computer game DC Universe Online, with several cartoon appearances, including Brave and the Bold. Although, animated series, we had the rather sort of aristocratic British voice, which I'm not entirely sure it fits. And although they did slightly tweak his origin story in the animated series to make it fit, I'm not sure. The really unique one that's caused a lot of controversy amongst Penguin fans, me being one of the ones who hates it, is the Nolan North portrayal. Nolan North isn't a real Cockney and has no way in hell of getting anywhere near the proper Cockney voice. However, having got into a bit of a debate with another fan about this, I can kind of see how it can just about be passable now. Because in this version of the Penguin's life, he was born in Gotham, but he was sent to England to school, but the family ran out of money and he ended up on the street, hence the accent. And the more I play through that game and listen to it again, it does sound I don't know if this was deliberate or not, but it does sound very much like an American trying his damnedest to do a Cockney accent, and failing spectacularly. And if you take it from that interpretation, it works perfectly. Even the sort of East End gangsters who were with him, they would have probably laughed behind his back at his pathetic attempts to try and do their voice. Plus, the speaker in his throat doesn't help much either. And again, that portrayal, it kind of has this it kind of has some of his social conscience in it. Not very much. He does tend to be more of a they kind of played up the collector angle of him and made him a bit of a kleptomaniac, which is more of a Catwoman thing, I think. But it kind of makes sense in the context of Arkham, where they want to make all of them into basically horror movie monsters. And probably one of the best ways of doing that was to either go and was to make him this sort of collector and this sort of creepy archivist type character, because they already had the kind of anarchy of the Joker and they needed something a bit more contained and something more contrasting for his gang war with the Joker. So yeah, when it comes to other portrayals, they do miss the point a lot, and I'm very grateful to Greg Rucka for taking some of the elements that have been established through these other media and reconciling them with what we know of the character from the comics in his work, Penguin, Pain and Prejudice, which is thoroughly recommended. When it comes to recommended reading, the problem is, for a lot of the more recent stuff that's actually in print, the Penguin will be taking a backseat whenever he does actually appear. There has, however, been a recent Secret Origin style story for him called Pain and Prejudice. I like this story, though I don't necessarily agree with the fact he's got an apocalyptic Pengbot plot, and that they redeem the character of his mother to make her more likeable, and he actually does get on with his mother, just not with the rest of his family, which doesn't quite ring true with me with some things he said previously in the comics about his family, and just generally how I understand the character. But it is a very good origin story nonetheless, and it has a lot of the greatest Penguin moments in comic history stuffed into it. Also, Batman Earth 1, which was released recently, has the Penguin as a major villain. I think they completely missed the point with him there, but it is a very interesting alternate take on him as a mayor of Gotham who is as bent as you can possibly get. This is basically a sort of Dick Cheney version of the Penguin. It is over the top, but it is enjoyable nonetheless. Further on, some of the cameo appearances are actually quite cool. Hush Money, there's a whole segment where he's talking about losing the gang war to Black Mask and being forced to serve Black Mask, which is a brilliant little insight into his psyche that I don't think is even in some of the more convoluted and complicated stories where he does take a main role. Similarly, Life After Death, which he does have a leading role in that, and he teams up with Jarvis Tetch, the Mad Hatter, which it seems like an odd pairing, but they both have very good taste in headwear, so yes. Finally, and probably most epically, Detective Comics numbers, I believe it's 1 to 7, the beginning of the Dollmaker storyline in the New 52, has the Penguin there, and I think the balance they get with him there, right, because he is actually taking an antagonistic role in that, but it's not as big an antagonistic role as the person who's trying to rip him off. And he does actually come across both sympathetically and scarily at the same time, which I think is something of a triumph in that one, and I hope to get around to reviewing it at some point. So yeah, that's the Penguin. That's my little defense of him. I hope you've enjoyed this video.
You can be a goody two-shoes till the end of your days. You can listen to them say crime never pays. You can follow every law and fear the big black bat. But why would you want to? Where's the fun in that? Where's the fun in that? So smile, darn you smile. Everybody loves to grin. Follow my lead, recite my creed, and smile, darn you smile. Don't listen to the dullards say that life is a bore. Those fuddy-duddies spoil all my fun. That's why I strive to eradicate gloom. It's from that